Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's well. Yeah, so today we are going to focus on identifying and selecting opportunities. Specifically, we're talking about really how to size and forecast the market that you're in. This is the second in a series of webinars relating to basic market intelligence, um, skill sets, and learning. And yes, this one focuses on the looking at how to value the market that you're in and how to size it, and then how to forecast its growth going forward. Um, and then I think going forward from this, we'll be looking at things like um, how to segment markets, looking at different geographies, and then going on to different elements of market intelligence like competitive intelligence, etc. But this talk focuses on sizing and forecasting. Yeah, my name's Oliver Guridham. I work for the business research company. We're a market intelligence company that's been going for about 12, 13 years now. We have about 300 people, and we do lots of reports and lots of consulting projects that focus around this area. Our clients often ask us basically how big is the market that we're looking at or that we're interested in, and how fast is it growing? So it's one of the kind of core questions that we get asked. And this um, and so this is a key skill set for anyone working in this area, for uh, clients and customers, or for corporates that are interested in either assessing their own market or looking at potential markets to enter, for consultancies that support them. It's one of the key pieces of information that is looked at in most corporate actions. So, if a company's being looking at an acquisition or or being acquired, this is one of the pieces of information that is almost always included in that assessment, is like how big is the market that they're in and how much is it growing. We'll go on to talk in future discussions about things like, what share of that market does a particular company or player have, etc. But this time we're just looking really at how do you assess the market in the first place in terms of sizing it, and characterizing it, because you can't really size it without defining and characterizing it first. And then how do you assess the growth that's going on in the market? And we'll be talking primarily about valuing markets as well. To a lesser extent, this information also is relevant if you're looking at other types of market sizing, like volume, the volume of the market, units, etc. But we may look at that separately in the future. But this is particularly looking at, what is the market value of this particular market? How much is it worth? And how much is that expected to change going forward? Good. Uh, so the first thing that you need to do, if you're assessing and sizing a market, is to define it accurately. Um, and here, precision is key, because the worst thing you can do is have a poorly defined. If you have a poorly defined market, then you have a then and you're not, it's not completely clear what it is that you're looking at or what it is that you're sizing, then the information, whatever information you provide about that becomes um, of limited value because it's not clear to the user what it is that you're exactly um, uh, quantifying, right? And it may not be clear to you, and the information becomes vague and unspecific. So it's really important that you get a strong definition of the market. So first of all, you want to define the sort of core nature of the market. So for this, basically, you're looking at getting a dictionary definition to begin with, right? So if you're defining the coffee market, you need a clear, specific explanation of what coffee is. If you're sizing the stent market, then you need a clear definition of what a stent is. So just a sort of written definition, as I said, mostly you can take this from essentially from a dictionary definition. Then you need to decide what you're quantifying. Are you quantifying value, the dollar value of coffee sold, or are you quantifying volume, the number of um, jars of coffee being sold or cups of coffee being sold? Are you quantifying some kind of procedure like number of operations if it's a healthcare market or other metrics? As I said, in this discussion, we're going to mainly focus on when we're looking at market value, which is the kind of universal quantifier that is relevant across all markets, whereas the other ones are more complex often because there may be various volumes, there may be different unit sizes, there may be different service types in service industries, etc. So when you get into volume, you need to be even clearer about what it is that you're quantifying. Value is a kind of universal thing. It's just the total uh, value of the number of the market, and it has the benefit that it can cover multiple things. So it could cover small, medium, and large jars of coffee. Whereas if you were doing that in terms of units, you would need to break them out into separate and quantify them separately. If you're doing it in terms of value, it can be you can do one single sizing across the let's say the packaged coffee market, and it could cover a number of different products and unit sizes, etc. But you're clarifying that. For now, we're going to assume that we're looking at value. Then you need to start thinking about um, uh, inclusions and exclusions. So, going back to the coffee analogy, are we talking about instant coffee? Are we talking about ground coffee? Are we talking about coffee beans? Are we talking about coffee that's sold in as a semi-service in Starbucks or wherever? Or are we talking about all of it? Um, it's fine to however you define it, although I would say including very different things like Starbucks coffee and Nescafe ready coffee in one market will add to the complexity of doing that because you're quantifying quite different things at the same time. But you can do that as long as you're very clear about what it is that you're doing. Um, I think the next way to ensure that you're clear and you're thinking about what's in the market is to identify key market segments. Um, so yeah, this will help you clarify to the reader and to yourself, and you may, after identifying the segments, you may go back and rework on the base definition. What are the main segments? So if your main segments are dried coffee of different sizes, that helps to clarify the fact that you're talking only about the kind of instant coffee market. Yeah, so you list out what are the key segments within it. That also starts to affect your thinking about the market sizing and forecasting when you start to think about what are the different elements within your market, and is there any clear differentiation between them, or the growth trajectory that they're on. Where in the value chain are you is the product or service that you're looking at? So are you looking at this coffee when it's at the production stage? Are you looking at it at the stage where it's at the factory gate? So where it's sold from the manufacturer to the retailer, or you looking at the market size when it's sold at the retail level? That makes less of a difference if you're looking at units, although it still can, but it definitely makes a difference in terms of value because the retail at the retail stage, additional cost will have been added on to that product. And it will be the size of the market at the retail level will be larger in value terms than the size at the factory gate level. So again, just working out where in the value chain is the market that you're sizing. Again, both are possible, but they're different, and it needs to be clearly defined. And then is this production or consumption data? So that can be different in terms of, particularly in terms of the geography that it applies to. So you need to be clear about whether you're talking about the market in terms of what's consumed, or the market in terms of what's produced. So if you think of a car that's made in China and sold in the UK, if it's production data, then the value of that car would be counted in China, or that unit would be counted in China. If it's consumption data, then that unit would be counted in the UK. So again, need to be very clear. Is it product, is it service, or is it both? So um, uh, some things are relatively clear. You'd probably think automotive is relatively clear. You'd probably think as being a product. You'd probably think a Starbucks coffee is quite clearly a service. But most services have some element of product, like a Starbucks coffee, and a lot of products, let's say software as a product, often comes bundled with a certain amount of service, some support, some IT integration, etc. So in those cases, it can be both. Again, it's a matter of being clear about what's covered, and then again, that the segmentation can help you with that. So if you're thinking about IT services, is one of the segments kind of support services or consulting services that go along with the software and hardware. Well, if that's the case, then clearly you're talking about something that covers both product and service, even if it's a product-led market. And then a couple more things to think about when you're looking at the market forecasting. Is it real or nominal growth? Are you looking at with or without inflation? And then what is the period that you're covering? Is it short or is it long term? What period historically are you covering? What period forecast are you covering? So there's a lot to think there about in the process of defining a market, and it's as I said, it's a critical stage. If you don't spend the time and effort getting that right, then you will you'll be somewhat wasting your time when it comes to the actual exercise of calculating the size of your market because it won't be clear to yourself or to others exactly what it is that you're covering. Next slide, please. Um, Once you've got your definition, you should spend some more time characterizing the market, um, looking at essentially what it is, understanding and communicating to yourself and to your audience as much as possible about the nature of your market. And this is a step that's very often missed. People have a tendency to go straight to talking about trends or changes in a market without actually really trying to communicate as much as possible about what is the current state of the market. So, um, uh, some good frameworks to use to try and force out this thinking um, uh, are the four W's: what, why, how, when. I mean, it's not really four W's, but it's normally referred to as that, or there are different versions of it. Uh, but these are the ones that I tend to use. So, what is it? That should have been covered by the definition fairly strongly. Um, what's its purpose? Why is it used? Why do people choose one thing over another? What are the substitute products or services? Um, why does it exist? The needs it fulfills, demand factors driving it. How is it used? Uh, is it a luxury? Is it a necessity? Um, uh, and how is it produced? What are the key elements of the supply chain involved in its production? Um, is it consumable, a single-use product, a durable good? When is it used, and by whom? I think we haven't got who here, so like who uses it, and why do they use it, etc. So there are various versions of that, but the point is to force out your thinking and to um, uh, make your put your thinking in a concrete way about the market and ensure that you're being explicit about any implicit assumptions you have about the market. Now, this exercise may seem a bit simplistic or a bit obvious, but it is useful and important to drive out everything you know about it, and following. And this exercise should be done after you've spent a good amount of time doing some research into the market, certainly secondary research, ideally talking to some people within the market to understand it in as much depth as possible. Um, Next slide. Another framework for thinking about the market, product, price, promotion, we're seeing distribution here. Again, it's three P's really in a D. Is it a product or service or both? What are its features, design, key differentiators? How is it priced? Um, is demand elastic related to price or inelastic? So does demand fall away rapidly if the price increases? Promotion, what are the main advertising and marketing strategies for selling it? How is it sold? Is it sold through TV advertising? Is it sold through word of mouth? Is it sold through essentially just by price competition? All those kind of things. How much is it how much is spent on advertising? What types of how is it distributed? Is it sold by retailers, wholesalers, direct to the consumer, etc.? Is it B2B market or a B2C market? I think we've covered that somewhere else. Are there different are there direct sales from manufacturer to retailer? Are there key influencers outside the distributions channel, such as physicians in the in pharmaceutical sales. So yeah, as much detail and understanding there as you can, and as I said, making sure that you're thinking very clearly. There are kind of two steps to this process, and they need to be very clearly separated, or two exercises. One of them is what is the state of the market and what is the size of the market. So it's a snapshot, it's a photograph of what it is right now. And you need to bore down into that as much as you can in terms of your understanding of the market at this moment before you start thinking about how has it changed, just, historically over time, and how and then thinking about how will it change going forward. There's a tendency in a lot of analysis, both from market research companies, and even in newspapers and things like that, to rush straight to the phase of talking about change when we haven't really understood what the current state of something is. Next slide, please. So then, once you've done that and you've got a clear definition and characterization of the market that you're looking at, it's time to start pulling together the data for your market sizing exercise. And here, the first thing you're going to do is go out and research as much information as possible. So how do you do this? Um, there are a number of really excellent sources that can help you, and it's a matter of pulling together as much data as you can from different sources to begin with, not necessarily going straight into a process of evaluating the data, but pulling together as I said, as much data as possible, even data that isn't directly relevant but is associated or useful. So here, some of the key sources, and people will be able to add to this, but some of the key sources we use at the Business Research Company, we look at industry associations and trade bodies, governmental and global organizations. So these are some of the most important ones. So some of the industry associations produce very good data on their own industry. Some of it's freely available, some of it's released in press releases, some of it you have to buy. Governmental and global organizations. The great thing about this is that it's normally freely available, or certainly available, and quite high quality, etc. The difficulty is it's often high level, or at a higher level than you're looking at, but it's still an absolutely key source. National statistics organizations and then international organizations like the UN, the World Bank, Comtrade, OECD, many others. Um, Projects and tenders databases can be very useful in terms of getting an understanding of the size and frequency of trade that's going on in a market, and there are both local and international ones of those that can be investigated. Specialist journals and magazines can be very useful. Most industries have one or more specialist trade magazines that are kind of widely read. They're very useful for getting an understanding of the market and how it works and what's going on in it. But also they'll tend to quote a certain amount of relevant data as well. Commerce portals, whether these be B2B commerce portals or B2C ones like Amazon or Alibaba, give you some better understanding of pricing and type in terms of the product that's being sold. Less useful services markets, obviously. Company websites and filings are critical. So you're getting so they'll include raw data in terms of the revenue of the companies within the market, but also often the filings include some insights into what's going on with those companies and what's going on in the market. But most critical is the data. You can buy reports from wide range of companies, including the Business Research Company, which will give an understanding of the size and growth and the competitors within the market, but can be expensive. Or you can buy integrated models such as our own global market model. There are several others. They are useful in that they cover a huge range of, or what very wide range of different markets that can be compared, and on a ongoing basis, if you're looking at a number of different markets, then it can be a much better price proposition or value, and can give you a whole load of different uh, metrics and market sizing and forecast to contextualize what you're doing. Um, the part that I hadn't mentioned there, which ideally you would be doing to fill gaps within the data that you're gathering, but also um, uh, just to give you data, is to supplement your secondary research with primary research, talking to people, asking industry participants for their information, their understanding of the size of the market, their how much their organization is selling, etc., which is definitely useful, particularly useful when you come to start triangulating the data and finding out where you've got big data gaps and lacks of understanding. The only thing you have to remember with primary research when it comes to market sizing is, like, how do they know this information? So if you ask, even if somebody's an industry participant or an expert, and you ask them how big is this market, are they really communicating something based on their understanding and knowledge of the market, or are they just quoting back a figure that's been publicized from a market report, in which case it's not adding a huge amount of value. So you need to think about, how do they know that? If they're talking about their own company, if they're talking on the basis of discussions they've had in an industry conference or get together, that's useful. If it's just that they're quoting the generally accepted number for the industry, it's got some value because it's useful to understand that number is seen as realistic by the market, but it's not necessarily of huge value. So once you've pulled together all the data points that you can, so you should have some kind of, Excel with the years across one axis or side of a table, and then the different sources of data for your market in the geography that you're looking at along the other. And you've probably got bits and pieces, right? So you might have two or three different data points for the current year, one or two for earlier years, one or two for forecasts, one or two growth rates, maybe data in different formats, different currencies, etc. So you've got a kind of spread of information, and then you've got notes attached to each one, understanding what the source of that information is, any concerns on that source or limitations on that source, um, etc. You'll then get into the process of modeling that data, which is pulling it together and coming up with a kind of consensus estimate on it. And this is a skill in itself. You are weighing the different data points that you've got, potentially ruling out outliers that seem very different to the others. Maybe maybe you've asked primary sources about those to cross-check it, and you've realized that they don't align with anything that anyone thinks is correct. And you start to map together and fill in the gaps through a series of processes. Aggregation, averaging the estimates from different sources, maybe giving them different weightages according to your view of the source and the strength of the source. Um, Interpolation, filling in gaps between known data points. So maybe you have a hard data point for 2019 and a hard data point for 2024, and you're filling in the data points in between. But then you need to be careful with that because obviously, in that example, for example, you've had COVID in between, so you can't just straight line that. But you may be able to fill in the gaps with some assumptions about what has happened during that period. Um, Correlation, I'll come back to that. Extrapolation, extending a historical trend, or regression, taking a trend that's happening in the later years, and extending it backwards. Uh, and then things that come more into um, uh, yeah, and then others are correlation, linking market size or growth to known factors such as GDP or population, or ones which are specifically relevant to that market, or comparison, benchmarking against other countries and industries. Um, so it's an art, not a science. And the key thing is to ensure that you've got as much information, both about being clear about where the hard data is, and then what assumptions you're making and why, in the way that you are filling in gaps in the data. And that's kind of the best you can do. And one of the things that you'll find is as you make notes of um, the explanations for filling in gaps in the data, that can then drive your analysis of that data as you go forward. Um, Next slide. After that, you should have a complete set of data with a bunch of notes attached to it, and then you can do some sanity checking of that data. So if you're looking at value, um, does any volume data that you have make sense? So let's say you're doing the market for processed coffee or packaged coffee. If you've sized the market at 10 billion and you have um, most of the market, most of the value information you have relates to value, but you have a single data point that says, or a strong data point that says there are 1 million units of this item sold in a year, then you can divide that 10 billion by the 1 million and see whether that's a sensible number. I think that would come out at $1,000 per packaged per coffee package. That's clearly unrealistic, and therefore you'd see that there's something wrong there. If you've got pricing data, that can turn that can turn the value data into volume data the other way round. So if you know that packaged coffee is normally sold for $5 per unit, again, you can apply that. You can divide your value figure of 1 billion by that. That would be, I think that's right. I'm right in saying that would imply that there are 200 million packages of coffee sold in a year. Then you start thinking about is that realistic against the size of the population or the relevant population also thinking about frequency of use, etc. So all of these things can just be used now. Obviously, you're not going to know necessarily absolutely, okay, that's right, that's wrong, but you can it can give you an indication of something whether something's possible and realistic. Again, that's the case with per capita, obviously more relevant for consumer goods, but even, you can, it's worth checking even for um, other B2B markets. Is it possible that the expenditure relating to this for an individual in the country is $2,000 a year? Well, no, it's a very minor niche service that is only relevant to a small number of people. It's not possible that everybody in the country is spending $2,000 a year on it, and therefore you go back and recheck your information. Market shares are absolutely key in this. So if you've got revenue data, is the largest, how big is what proportion of your overall market share is the largest player making up. It's useful here if you have some understanding of the market and how concentrated or fragmented it is. But if that's coming to if the biggest player is coming to like a 1.01% of the market, that's probably wrong. If a small normal player is coming to a large share of the market, that's probably wrong and indicating that the market size is too small. So we've got hard revenue figures. They're very useful for um, driving your sizing of the market, but also for cross-checking it. Same thing for related markets and related geographies. So if you've got hard data for another geography, if you've got hard data for the US, and you're estimating the size of the Belgian market and your market size is for Belgium is bigger than the US, something is almost certainly wrong. If you're sizing the market for a niche or product, and the overall product category is only just bigger than the niche that niche estimate that you've got, then something is almost certainly wrong. So it's seeing them. It's all about with these things, seeing the data in context and relating everything and making sensible assumptions. It's a mixture of an art and a science. And the key thing is to relate everything together, consider all possible information, keep an open mind, and also then just really concentrate on communicating, being as transparent as possible and communicating what it is that you've done. Uh, Great. I've been talking a lot. Uh, Sonia, do we want to take a little break for a second? We've sort of finished the market sizing part, and then we go on to the market forecasting part in a second. Do we want to take a break now, or just check whether anyone's got any questions?
Anybody has any questions? We do not see any questions in the chat box. I'm presuming if anybody has to ask, can ask right now. We'll give it a second.
No doubts as of now.
Yeah, hi Oliver.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Tanya. I have a question.
Sure.
With evolving consumer preferences and regulatory changes, what strategies can companies use to stay ahead of market trends and adapt proactively?
I think it's a good question. I think we will come on to more of that in the future discussions. At the moment, I'm really focusing on how you size and forecast the market. Once you've got that information, you can then be thinking about what strategies that you adopt. So I think I will focus more on that in future discussions. I know I know the subject of it is related to that, but I thought it was important to cover the basic processes and skills involved in sizing and forecasting a market before we move on to how we utilize that information to then brainstorm strategies, etc. So if you hold that question off, we will definitely cover it in future discussions, probably in the next webinar.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, thank you, Oliver.
No problem.
All right, so if anybody does not have any more questions, we can move ahead. I don't think we have a lot left, Oliver. This does surmise a lot.
Good. Yeah, great. So we'll move on to forecasting. So the next slide, please. So how do you go about building a market forecast? There are different ways of doing it, but I'm talking about the way that we do it. Obviously, throughout this, I'm talking about the way that the business research companies, the processes that we've learned and follow. There are others for in other circumstances. If you have better, more consistent data, you can, for example, you can do much more detailed regression forecasting, etc. When it comes to macroeconomic forecasting and things, it's done in quite a different way. But it's what we're talking about is methodologies for sizing a market where there's limited um, uh, information available. And you're piecing together the information from public sources with anything that you can gather from primary research, anything that you can extrapolate, etc. The same is true again for the forecast methodology. This is a high level view of the way that we do it at TBRC, and the way that we communicate to our clients, who tend to be happy with it once they understand how we've gone about it. It has the advantage of being very transparent and clear, as well as reasonably robust, given the nature of the data available. So, what are the factors? So, forecasting the market is made up of a combination of both quantitative and qualitative factors. First of all, you look at the historic growth rate, and then the key other quantitative factors that you'll use are GDP growth for the geography or region that you're looking at, and then inflation. Those two factors may be split out, or they may be together. GDP growth may include inflation as well. And then the way that we do it is we take the historic data that we have for the market. So it's the information on the historic growth rate. Now that may be from our own estimation, built up on the factors that we've already covered for the historic period, or it may be hard data that's available from a public source, or harder data that's available from a public source. We then strip out GDP growth. If we have that separate from inflation, then we'll do that. If they're together, and it's nominal GDP growth, including inflation, then we'll take the whole of that out from the historic growth rate to give us the kind of raw industry specific growth rate for that market. We'll then extrapolate that forward in raw form. So we'll basically kind of straight line that forward at that stage. But it doesn't mean that this is a straight line forecast, because a lot of other factors come into it. And then we re-add back in forecast GDP growth and inflation. Okay. So what you're doing is trying to find out what is the raw growth, what is the specific growth relating to that market in the historic period, then you assume that that moves forward. There's some caveats on that which I'll come to, and then but then you add on to the specific market growth the macro growth factors or macro decline factors like inflation and GDP forecast, and add them back in so that you're looking at the industry specific driver, quantitative driver, but then adding in the macro driver going forward. And yes, I think most of you will be familiar with the CAGR formula, which is the way that you communicate and cross compare growth rates. And you can see the formula there for anybody who needs it. You can also, Excel has it as a defined formula, so you can simply put it into Excel and it will give you the CAGR, or it will drive CAGR figures forward for you. Yes, and we usually use the compound annual growth rate to because the market is we're looking at the way that the market builds on itself. Next slide. The internal growth rate. One factor to consider there in terms of taking the historic growth rate is that probably applies for most stages of the market maturity cycle. But you should be aware of roughly where your product is in terms of your market is in terms of maturity. So you can probably assume that historic growth will be in some way related to, forecast growth will be related to historic growth in the more mature parts of this process. So growth, maturity. You may decide if it's reaching saturation that there's going to be a significant change. But particularly in the early parts of a growth curve and in the exponential parts of growth, you need to be willing to drive up and forecast very high growth rates from a small base, particularly in breakthrough technology markets, etc. So you should be very careful that you're not just assuming that markets will grow in some way related to GDP. In the early stage of technology breakthrough markets, they can be growing at 20, 50, even 100% per year. Yeah. Next slide. So once you've got that quantitative base, you're then going to tweak it using qualitative factors, which you'll then enumerate and turn into hard factors that can be used in your forecast. So a good way to come up with relevant factors is to use a Pestel framework, political, economic, social, technological, ecological, and legal factors that are affecting the market. Draw out the key ones from your research and your reading, and then estimate the impact of them. Are they a positive or negative driver of the forecast? Are they and to what extent, right? So it isn't a hard science but you will want to go beyond. Can't just assume that the market's going to grow at its historic rate plus the macroeconomic growth rate. There will be market specific factors that will be driving or restricting growth, and you should be covering them. And the good thing about breaking them out in this way and giving each of those factors a quantitative number is that you are that it makes your analysis and the reasons for your analysis very clear. One of the things that you should be particularly focused on, which are harder, are things that we know are going to happen in the future. So, for instance, if we know that a particular drug is coming off patent, that's a known factor that should be included in our forecast. If we know that a major project is being opened, increasing capacity in a particular market in 2027, that should be reflected. So it shouldn't just be soft factors or qualitative factors. Where hard information is available, you should be reflecting that. And think about the segments within your market and try and break it down a little bit as much as you can to that level. Are some of the segments within the market growing very quickly? Are some of them growing more slowly? And does your overall blended growth rate reflect that effectively? Next slide. Good. So that kind of sums up and the process for sizing and forecasting the market. Perhaps you can flick forward, Sonia, to the slide after this, so just to summarize that. Next slide. Yes, this one. So just to recap the key process. So define and characterize the market, very, very important, as clearly as possible. Gather all the available data that you can pull together and understanding, mainly from secondary, mainly hard data, but can be from interviews, etc. as well. Model out the gaps, being very clear about your thinking and assumptions that you're making where you're filling out gaps. So that should give you a historic set of data, the size of the market, and it's the historic development of the market over the period that you're looking at, so 5 to 10 years normally. Then you start looking at the forecast. You calculate the raw data, taking into account the historic growth, the macro factors. You look at the trends and the qualitative factors affecting the market. That gives you your forecast, and then you do sanity checks and across all of your data, both the historic and the forecast, and then you do regular reviews of it. If it's if it's a market that you're looking at regularly, you should be going back to it every 6 months or a year to check that the assumptions are correct. Or if there's a major change in the market, like something in an external shock to the market or an internal shock to the market. But let's say, the most obvious example being COVID, everything gets thrown out in terms of the forecast in one go, and you need to reassess it completely at that point. But under normal circumstances, you probably want to be revisiting these things at least annually to check that your assumptions and your forecast assumptions are still valid. Yeah, so that's the key process, and I think it's been a slightly kind of process heavy discussion today, but we'll go in a lot more in the next sessions into how you use this information, how it affects your strategy, etc. But I thought it was important to go through the really core basic part about, well, not basic, it is a key skill of how to go about sizing and forecasting markets. And then if you go back one step, just a few other things to remember in the process. To the slide before, yeah, just a few things to remember. Transparency is key. Giving as much information about how your data is sourced and what the assumptions are within your data makes it more believable, but also more usable for your clients or your internal consumers within your company, etc. they can add their own assumptions or understand what you've done. They may be able to take parts of it, even if they're not comfortable with the whole, or to question things or to come back to you. So transparency is key. This is an estimation exercise. It's producing the best possible estimate of the market. So don't pretend that it's an exact science, and give don't present the data that you've estimated as if it's right to the 15th decimal point. Better to put it at a high level, or a level which represents the reality of what level you can be confident about the data. So I would tend to stick to more rounded figures, because the reality is that the additional decimals don't really mean anything. You can't be confident of your accuracy to that level. And then I said regularly review the historic data about once a year, based on whether new data has come out. It might be more frequent in some rapidly reported markets, like commodity markets, where there are frequent price changes, etc. But in many markets, data is not coming out, new data points are not coming out that frequently. But the forecasts you may well need to update more frequently than that, because they can be affected by by factors which aren't specific to the individual market, but which are macro and happening in the political environment. Say tariff changes, wars, etc., can have an impact, and you may need to revise your forecast based on those at very quick notice. Good. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Soumya, do you want to check whether there are any other questions now?
Yes, there are again no questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? This would be the right time.
Yeah, hi Oliver.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Berlin. So I have a question, like if a company invests in a market research report, and then suddenly a drastic market shift occurs, like economic downturn or like new regulations like that, then how should consultants help clients to adapt their strategy based on outdated data?
Yeah. Well, this is one thing that I would emphasize the value of buying a database. Obviously, I would advocate TBRC's global market model, which is a integrated database of thousands of different markets sized and forecasted. But the good things with those kind of databases is that they can update very quickly when things change in the market. So you can get new forecasts, etc., that have taken these big changes into account. Otherwise, it can be difficult, and it's frustrating if you spend a lot of money on a report and you have to go and buy another one because things have changed. However, if you bought them from the report from a good supplier that's given a good amount of information supporting their forecasts, and you can therefore understand what factors they've considered in their forecast, you should be able to then tweak it yourself and adapt the forecast for your understanding. Good suppliers will be willing to share a simplified version of the model that drives their forecast for that market, so that you can then play around with the factors yourself. So yeah, it's a matter really of who you've used, but they should be willing to support you in allowing you to continue to get value from that investment.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Oliver. Sophia here.
Hello.
So my question is, what are the most common mistakes the companies makes when they are calculating market size and growth rate? and how they can just ensure more accurate projections?
Well, in terms of the second question, I think, I've described the methodology for how to give accurate projections, or what we feel is a strong methodology for giving good quality projections, which then and also for being transparent about what you've done so people can understand it. I think the most common mistake is to think too much about change and not enough about really assessing the market and the market size in the first place, and failing to do enough sanity checks, failing to people just accepting these very large numbers sort of without really thinking about them and without applying their common sense to whether they're viable and possible or not. That I would say the most common. And then I guess lack of relating the data to other markets, etc., which obviously is hard. It certainly is helpful to have a big database of information covering a very wide range of information, like the global market model or similar things, so that you can compare market sizes in different countries, related markets, different related geographies, etc., and see whether the data is sensible and realistic.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver.
No problem.
All right.
Do you want to introduce the next webinar, Soumya?
Yes. So we do have a question. Yes, you can, Ritvik. Yes, you can drop your emails. According to the plan that we have a series of around 7 webinars in our go-to-market series, and the next one is scheduled on 12th of March. So you can drop in your emails and we will send you the invite, and we will also be sending you the invites anyway and the recording for this session. And the next session's topic is how to optimize your marketing mix. And I think we all know that's one of the most important steps in setting up any of the businesses that we have. So see you soon. See you there. Please register and let your friends also know. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.